Colette in Enfield. Hello, Colette.
Good morning, Nick. Thank you for taking my call.
Not at all.
I think my question is going back to Parliament and the decision, the framework in which Parliament was asked to make a decision about whether or not we might potentially get involved. Mm-hmm. Why was it that Parliament was called back a week early when you didn't have the same level of factual information that President Obama was able to give literally 24 hours later? And the concern that I have is that should we do the limited, short, sharp warfare, it would be an illegal action because it wouldn't have the mandate of the United Nations. I'm sorry, that's a
Sure. No. Very, very important questions, Colette, on both. I mean, first, on the latter one, we published legal advice which demonstrated very clearly that under international humanitarian law, there was a firm legal base in order to take action, in order to deter the use of these weapons on humanitarian grounds, and we were very open about that because, of course, one of the most important lessons of the kind of political trauma, if you like, never mind the human trauma of 10 years ago of Iraq, was the whole debate about the legality. And of course, we would never do anything that is not legally sound. And so there is a legal justification under a doctrine called responsibility to protect, which means that even if there's gridlock in the Security Council, you can under international humanitarian law, because let's remember also, though legally this is a separate issue, but it's nonetheless, I think, relevant. The use of chemical weapons is a war crime under customary international law. On the first point, the facts that we made available and the analysis that we published from the Joint Intelligence Committee on our understanding of what happened on that terrible night on the 21st of August are still the facts that we've got available to us. And of course, the Americans are entirely free to publish their own information. But we were never going to go to Parliament and say, oh, by the way, we'll only make our case depending on what another country says. You have to present your case based on what we believe. That's what we did then, and obviously we didn't succeed in making that case in Parliament. And it's what we would do now.
Colin. May I ask one last question?
Sure.
And thank you for your response. Is the niggling problem I have at the back of my head? I mean, chemical warfare is bad. I mean, there's no discussion about that. But it's being alleged that Syria has used chemical warfare 14 times. Yeah. So why is it on the 15th we suddenly stand up and say this is wrong?
No, that's a very fair point. The answer is the scale of it. The scale of what happened on the 21st is just so far in excess of anything that happened on those previous occasions. But you make a perfectly fair point, which is that actually the documented number of times that Assad has used chemical weapons now suggests, because we have proof that he used it 14 times. He may have used it on a small scale elsewhere in instances which we haven't been able to detect, but that is already being done on a more frequent scale than any other time by any other brutal dictator in living memory. And you're right, it's both that cumulative effect of the frequency of the very small-scale use of chemical weapons and then the very large-scale, because this was a very large-scale systematic attack against men, women and children in that eastern suburb of Damascus on that fateful night.
Thanks for that, Colette. Just briefly, Deputy Prime Minister, when you were in the studio this time last week, you made a very impassioned and I could tell heartfelt stance that you believed action was right because you were from a generation of politicians, and if you failed at this first hurdle, you felt you'd be letting the country, if not the world, down. You did fail. How did you feel that night?
I regret the decision. Of course I was disappointed.
How do you feel inside? That's politicians' words, Mr. Clegg.
I do feel heartfelt about this. I can't hide it. I totally respect why people feel differently to me. I totally understand that the public mood is very much against us joining any American action. I personally cannot hide now, as much as I couldn't last week before the parliamentary debate, that I think when you are in a position of responsibility and something as momentous as that happened, and it is momentous when someone is using chemical weapons, as I just explained to Colette, first very frequently, more frequently than has been done in living memory, but secondly then on a very large scale, I just continue to worry terribly about the precedent we set. And it might not be a precedent, by the way, where we see the effects tomorrow or even next year, but in the years to come, that in the face of that, given we've basically had a pretty strong prohibition against chemical weapons since the aftermath of the First World War, that this generation basically said we couldn't really muster the decision, if you like, to take action to deter it further. But look, we are where we are. I'm above and beyond everything else a Democrat, and of course I understand, and I don't begrudge friends and colleagues who think differently to me. But you're right, I'm not going to hide my own personal view. As a committed internationalist, you've got to remember also partly where I come from. You know, my whole family, like lots of families, was disfigured by the kind of terrible violence and abuses of my dad's mum fled from revolutionary Russia. My mum spent a large part of her childhood in a prisoner of war camp. You just kind of, so it's partly about where you come from as a person as well as what your political views are. And I just think sometimes you have to do the uncomfortable thing, which is say, no, a line's been crossed. This cannot go without consequences.
And lastly, putting your political hat back on as leader of the Lib Dem party, we mustn't forget that, of course, your view of the leader of the opposition.
Well, look, again, I don't at all begrudge Ed Miliband the fact that he had to sort of wrestle with something which was difficult, and everybody did. And there's no monopoly of wisdom on this. There's no perfect science. There is no perfect answer. This is about a balance of risks. And I keep, and I would say to Colette and others, of course I understand the risks of doing nothing, of doing something. I equally want people to understand there are risks of doing nothing. But on Ed Miliband's part, I think what was frustrating was that we had bent over backwards to address all the concerns that he and Douglas Alexander had raised in meetings with me and David Cameron and telephone conversations between Ed Miliband and David Cameron. We changed our motion constantly. I mean, even right up to the last minute, we changed it to accept a succession of suggestions they made. And then you had this rather odd situation at the end where we'd said, look, we are genuinely trying to be consensual because it's in everybody's interest that we don't make this a party political point scoring issue. We've accepted all your suggestions. And then they came up with this rival motion to divide the House rather than unite it, even though the motions were, as Ming Campbell said, to all intents and purposes, the same. And that's when I just really thought, well, hang on a minute, surely we can just rise to the occasion and try and sort of not create rival motions which say almost exactly the same thing, but instead try and act in the national and international interest.
OK, other calls?
Paul Imbo.
Hello there. Hello, Nick. It's that sort of the issue of why we are where we are now, and your response to it, which I want to touch on, because I think what you just stated, some of the principles there of why we had to act, and I think you're the politician who's made the clearest statement of that. I think in particular in that Q&A session you did with the Lib Dems, where you sort of emphasised how important it was that Assad felt some sort of physical consequence for him, otherwise he'll think that he can get away with it, and other despots, and you said of course there are many of them, will get the same message and build up their own stockpiles of chemical weapons. But that being the case, and what all that the government is proposing is a limited a strike, not boots on the ground, not getting involved in the war. The point was that if
I could move you to your question, Paul, I'm terribly sorry. It's just everybody's trying to get through to
in the vote last week, both sides were asking, as you said, for the same thing. It was like two duelists who shot each other and killed each other.
Okay, so
given
what is your question?
Why are we not revisiting it? Why the insistence we can't go back and consider it again?
But because, Paul, I really don't think there's much sense in asking the same question when. In many ways, people say, oh, well, there might be more facts. Do you know that the facts, I think, are pretty clear, and they might be refined here or there. But at the end of the day, you need to make a judgment. Do you think the scale of the atrocity and the war crime which took place merits us joining the Americans in an American-led initiative to deter that, yes or no? And I just think Parliament has spoken. We've got to respect the will of Parliament and not imagine that by keep asking the same question, we're going to get a different answer. So both myself and the Prime Minister are very clear. We don't, in a sense, resolve from our own views, but we respect above and beyond everything else the will of Parliament, reflecting deep scepticism and anxiety in the country, and get on now with providing actually some of the largest humanitarian efforts anywhere in the world in Syria, working diplomatically in the United Nations, working politically at the G20 this week and elsewhere to make sure that we do apply international pressure to stop these kind of atrocities happening, but not participating in what the Americans have in mind. And that's the only sensible way to proceed, given that we, thankfully, unlike, by the way, the people of Syria, live in a democracy, in a parliamentary democracy.
And what do you hope to come out from St. Petersburg as regards Syria?
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I'm holding my breath that there will be consensus, because this is something which sharply divides opinion, not least, of course, opinion between Barack Obama and Vladimir Putin. But I would like to see those who are reluctant in the international community to do anything to show what they would then do instead, because surely everyone can agree at the G20 that such a war crime cannot go without any consequences whatsoever.